In the summer of 1546, a young woman was carried to her execution in a chair, her body too shattered by torture to walk. Her name was Askew, a noblewoman who had been stretched upon the rack, an instrument of agony normally reserved for common criminals. Even with her joints torn apart and her spirit tested beyond human limits, she refused to betray her fellow Protestants. Her story remains one of the most chilling examples of religious persecution in Tudor England, where conscience could cost everything and the machinery of state terror struck with terrifying precision. Anne was born around 1521 into a wealthy Lincolnshire family and came of age during one of England's most turbulent eras, the Protestant Reformation. Henry VIII had broken with Rome and declared himself head of the English Church, but his own beliefs shifted constantly, making it impossible to know which doctrines were safe and which might lead straight to the stake. Catholics still held great influence at court, while reformers pushed for sweeping changes. The Act of 6 Articles in 1539 reaffirmed Catholic doctrine, yet under royal supremacy, creating a strange hybrid faith that satisfied neither side. In this treacherous landscape, Anne possessed something rare and dangerous: an educated mind and unwavering convictions. She could read Latin, studied the scriptures deeply, and would not compromise her faith. Her marriage to Thomas Kyme, a Catholic chosen by her family, was unhappy from the beginning. Arguments over religion consumed their home, and eventually, Anne did something almost unthinkable for a Tudor woman. She left her husband and children to pursue her religious calling in London. This act was both shocking and perilous. A wife was expected to obey her husband's faith. By walking away, Anne forfeited her children, her property, and her social standing. She became, in effect, a religious exile in her own country. To the authorities, her defiance was doubly dangerous. She challenged not only Catholic doctrine but also the patriarchal order that kept women in submission. In London's underground Protestant circles, Anne quickly became known as a brilliant theologian and fearless speaker. She debated scripture with learned men, rejected the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, denied priestly authority to forgive sins, and condemned the worship of saints. These convictions, ordinary among Protestants today, were considered heresy then, punishable by death. Her eloquence inspired many, but it also drew the relentless attention of those determined to silence her. Moved through this network with remarkable boldness, attending clandestine services, and distributing prohibited literature, she corresponded with other reformers across England and Europe, creating a paper trail that would later be used against her. Her house became a meeting place for like-minded believers, a sanctuary where forbidden ideas could be discussed freely. Yet this very openness would prove her undoing, as government spies infiltrated Protestant circles with increasing frequency. Anne's downfall began in 1545, when she was first arrested for heresy. The charges were serious: distributing prohibited books and preaching Protestant doctrine. But they were also carefully crafted to test the limits of royal protection. Her connections to powerful Protestant nobles, including the Queen's own Catherine Parr, initially protected her. She was released after questioning, but the authorities were not finished with her. They suspected she was part of a larger Protestant network that threatened the Catholic faction at court. What they needed were names, and they believed in Askew held the key to unraveling the entire conspiracy. The political context of Anne's persecution cannot be understated. By 1546, the aging Henry VIII was increasingly erratic, and various factions were positioning themselves for the succession struggle that would follow his death. The Catholic Party, led by men like Stephen Gardiner and Thomas Wriothesley, saw an opportunity to destroy their Protestant rivals by proving their disloyalty to the crown. If they could demonstrate that Queen Catherine Parr herself was involved in heresy, they could eliminate the Protestant faction entirely and control the young Prince Edward's future reign. Her second arrest in June 1546 marked the beginning of an ordeal that would shock even hardened Tudor officials. Taken to the Tower of London, Anne faced interrogation by some of the most powerful men in England, including Lord Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley and Sir Richard Rich. These were not cruel men by the standards of their age, but calculating politicians who saw Anne as a means to greater ends. They demanded she reveal the names of other Protestants, particularly those with connections to Queen Catherine P. The stakes were enormous. If they could prove the Queen herself was involved in heresy, they could destroy the Protestant faction entirely and reshape English religion. The interrogation techniques used on Anne were sophisticated and psychological as well as physical. Her questioners were learned theologians who could match her scriptural knowledge, making debates that lasted hours as they tried to trap her in contradictions. They alternated between threats and promises, offering her freedom if she would cooperate, and describing in vivid detail what awaited her if she refused. They brought in former friends who had already confessed, hoping peer pressure would break her resolve. When these methods failed, they resorted to sleep deprivation and dietary manipulation, weakening her body to make her mind more pliable. When verbal interrogation failed to break her resolve, the authorities made an unprecedented decision. For the first time in English history, a woman of noble birth would be subjected to the rack. This decision violated every social convention of the era and required explicit authorization from the highest levels of government. The rack was considered beneath the dignity of the nobility, reserved for common criminals and traitors. Yet, Anne's refusal to name names had driven her interrogators to desperation. They were willing to break centuries of precedent to extract the information they needed, knowing that the torture of a noblewoman would send shockwaves through English society. The decision to torture Anne was not made lightly or in anger, but as a calculated political strategy. Her interrogators understood that news of her treatment would spread throughout Protestant circles, potentially terrorizing others into submission. They also believed that her gender made her more likely to break under physical pressure, a miscalculation that revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of her character. The authorization to use the rack came from the king himself, showing how high the stakes had risen in the religious and political struggles of the era. The torture chamber in the Tower of London was a place designed to break both body and spirit. The rack itself was a wooden frame with rollers at each end, operated by handles that stretched the victim's body to excruciating limits. The room was deliberately intimidating, with implements of torture displayed to maximize psychological impact before physical pain even began. As Anne was strapped to the device, she would have seen the pulleys and ropes that would soon tear her joints apart. The psychological torture began before the physical. The anticipation of pain, the knowledge that her body would be systematically destroyed. Yet even facing this instrument of agony, she maintained her defiance. The rack operated on a simple but horrifying principle: gradual and relentless stretching of the human body beyond its natural limits. The victim was laid on their back, wrists and ankles secured 2 rollers at each end of the wooden frame. As the handles were turned, the rollers moved in opposite directions, pulling the body taut. The pain began as discomfort progressed to agony, and culminated in the sickening sound of joints separating from their sockets. The process could be stopped and started, allowing interrogators to alternate between torture and questioning. The victim remained conscious throughout, forced to endure not just physical agony, but the psychological terror of knowing the torture could resume at any moment. What happened next defied every expectation of Tudor interrogators. As the rack slowly pulled Anne's body apart, dislocating her shoulders, hips, and other joints, she continued to refuse their demands. The pain would have been beyond description. Imagine every joint in your body being pulled from its socket while you remained conscious. Contemporary witnesses reported that the torture was so severe that Ardsley himself operated the rack when the professional torturer refused to continue. The Tower's executioner, a man hardened by years of inflicting pain, was so disturbed by what he was ordered to do that he abandoned his post rather than continue the torture of a woman. The psychological impact on Anne's torturers was as significant as the physical impact on her body. Wraithsley, a man accustomed to the brutal realities of Tudor politics, found himself personally operating the rack in a desperate attempt to break her will. Sir Richard Rich, equally hardened by years of interrogation and execution, was reportedly shaken by Anne's refusal to yield. These men had broken countless prisoners through torture, but they had never encountered someone who maintained such absolute silence despite such extreme suffering. Her defiance challenged their understanding of human nature and their confidence in their methods. The technical aspects of Anne's torture were recorded in disturbing detail by court officials who witnessed the proceedings. The rack was operated in stages, with periods of extreme stretching, followed by slight releases that allowed blood to flow back into compressed joints. This technique maximized suffering while preventing the quick unconsciousness that might have provided merciful escape. Between sessions, Anne was returned to her cell, where she was forced to lie motionless as dislocated joints swelled and muscles cramped. The constant pain served as a reminder of what awaited her if she continued to refuse cooperation. The aftermath of her torture revealed the true extent of her suffering. Anne's body was so damaged that she could no longer walk or even stand. Her arms hung useless at her sides, her legs unable to support her weight. In an age without painkillers or proper medical care, she endured constant agony that would have driven many to madness. Yet her mind remained sharp and her faith unbroken. From her cell, she continued to write, producing some of the most powerful religious poetry of the Tudor era. Her words smuggled out of the tower inspired other Protestants and demonstrated that her spirit remained unconscious. Anne's writings from the tower reveal a woman transformed by suffering, but not broken by it. Her poems speak of physical agony, but also of spiritual triumph, of a body destroyed, but a soul intact. She wrote of conversations with God in her cell, of visions that sustained her through the darkest hours. These works, circulated secretly among Protestant sympathizers, became some of the most powerful propaganda of the Reformation. They showed that even the worst persecution could not destroy true faith, that the human spirit could transcend physical suffering when sustained by religious conviction. The legal proceedings that followed were a mockery of justice designed to provide legitimacy for a predetermined outcome. Anne was condemned for heresy based on her religious writings and statements, but the real crime in the eyes of her persecutors was her refusal to implicate others. The trial was brief and the outcome predetermined, conducted in a chamber where she had to be supported by attendants because her tortured body could not sit upright. She was sentenced to be burned alive at the stake, the standard punishment for heresy. For most victims, this would have been terrible enough, but Anne faced an additional horror. She would endure the flames while her body remained crippled from torture. The sentencing of an Askew was attended by the highest officials of the realm, transforming what should have been a routine heresy trial into a state spectacle. The judges who condemned her were the same men who had authorized her torture, creating a circular system of justice where the accusers, torturers, and judges were identical. Her inability to stand during the proceedings created a visual reminder of the state's power to destroy those who opposed it. The sentence was read while she slumped in her chair, her dislocated joints unable to support her body's weight. The weeks between her sentencing and execution were filled with continued attempts to break her will. Priests visited her cell daily, offering salvation in exchange for confession and recantation. Government officials dangled promises of reprieve if she would name just one fellow Protestant. Even her estranged husband was brought to the tower, hoping that family loyalty might succeed where torture had failed. Yet Anne remained steadfast, using these visits to preach her beliefs rather than abandon them. Her consistency in the face of such inducements amazed even her enemies, who had expected the combination of torture and false hope to destroy her resolve. On July 16, 1546, the final act of this tragedy began. Anne had to be carried to Smithfield, London's traditional execution ground, in a chair, because her tortured body could not support her weight. The procession through London's streets was unlike any previous heresy execution. Usually, condemned heretics walked to their deaths, sometimes recanting along the way to earn easier deaths. Anne's chair became a mobile pulpit from which she continued preaching, her voice carrying two crowds who had gathered not to celebrate the death of a heretic, but to witness the fate of a woman whose courage had become legendary. The crowd that gathered at Smithfield was unusual in its composition and mood. Typically, heretic burnings drew celebratory crowds who saw the executions as righteous punishment for religious crimes. Anne's execution attracted a more somber gathering that included many secret Protestant sympathizers who had come to witness her final moments. Even her enemies acknowledged her extraordinary bravery, with some Catholics present expressing private doubts about the justice of her treatment. The government had deployed extra guards, fearing that Protestant supporters might attempt a rescue or that the crowd might turn violent in response to the spectacle. The execution site itself had been carefully prepared to maximize both the deterrent effect and the efficiency of the killing. The stake was positioned for maximum visibility, with cleared sightlines allowing the largest possible crowd to witness the proceedings. Bundles of underscore were arranged to ensure a hot, fast, burning fire that would quickly consume the victim. Yet for Anne, even these preparations took on a grotesque quality, as her broken body had to be lifted from the chair and secured to the stake with extra bindings to prevent her from collapsing into the flames prematurely. The execution itself was designed to be merciful by Tudor standards, though mercy is a relative term when discussing burning alive. Bags of gunpowder were tied around Anne's body, intended to cause quick explosions that would end her suffering rapidly. This was considered a kindness, typically reserved for those who showed repentance or who had influential friends. Yet, even this small mercy became another element of horror. The explosions would tear apart her already broken body while she remained conscious. The gunpowder was positioned at strategic points to ensure that the explosions would be fatal rather than merely painful. A technical consideration that reveals the systematic nature of Tudor execution practices. As the flames rose around her, Askew faced her final moments with the same courage she had shown throughout her ordeal. Witnesses reported that she remained conscious longer than most victims, her lips moving in what appeared to be prayer even. As the fire consumed her clothing and began to char her skin, the gunpowder explosions when they came were so violent that they scattered burning debris across the execution ground, forcing spectators to step back from the intensity of the blast. Yet even these explosions seemed insufficient to end her suffering quickly, as contemporary accounts describe her continuing to move after the first detonations. The immediate aftermath of Anne's execution revealed the complex emotions her death had stirred throughout London, while government officials celebrated the elimination of a dangerous heretic. Many spectators left Smithfield in silence, disturbed by what they had witnessed. Reports spread quickly through the city of her extraordinary courage and the unprecedented brutality of her treatment. Protestant sympathizers began collecting and preserving her writings, ensuring that her story would survive her death. Even some Catholics expressed private reservations about the decision to torture and execute a woman whose only crime was religious conviction. The impact of Anne's death reverberated far beyond the execution ground at Smithfield. News of her torture spread throughout Protestant Europe, where it was seen as evidence of Catholic barbarity and English tyranny. Her writings, preserved and published after her death, inspired generations of reformers who saw in her story proof that faith could triumph over the worst human cruelty. The fact that she had been tortured, something unprecedented for a woman of her class, became a rallying cry for Protestant propagandists who used her story to demonstrate the extremes to which their opponents would go. Protestant martyrologists, particularly John Foxe in his Book of Martyrs, ensured that Anne's story became part of the foundational narrative of English Protestantism. Her account was read aloud in churches, inspiring countless believers to maintain their faith despite persecution. The contrast between her courage and her torturers' brutality became a powerful propaganda tool that helped shape English religious identity for centuries. Her story was particularly influential in the American colonies, where Puritan settlers saw her as a model of resistance to religious tyranny. The international response to Anne's execution was immediate and severe. Protestant rulers across Europe condemned the torture of a noble woman as a violation of Christian principles and aristocratic privilege. The Holy Roman Emperor, despite his own persecution of Protestants, privately criticized the English methods as excessive and counterproductive. French Protestants used her story to demonstrate the dangers of Catholic power, while German reformers incorporated her writings into their own theological arguments. Her death became a diplomatic embarrassment for England, damaging its reputation across Protestant Europe. Askew's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the lengths to which people will go to defend their beliefs, both as victims and as perpetrators. Her torturers were not monsters, but respected officials who believed they were protecting England from religious chaos. They genuinely thought that extracting names from Anne could prevent greater bloodshed and preserve social order. Thomas Wriothesley and Richard Rich were educated men who attended church regularly and considered themselves devout Christians. Yet in their zeal to protect their vision of truth, they committed acts that shocked their own contemporaries and continue to horrify us today. The bureaucratic machinery that enabled Anne's torture reveals how Israeli institutional evil can flourish when individuals surrender moral responsibility to higher authorities. Each official involved in her persecution could point to orders from above, creating a system where no one felt personally responsible for the ultimate outcome. From above, creating a system where no one felt personally responsible for the ultimate outcome. The guards who carried her to the rack, the clerks who recorded her responses, the judges who condemned her, all were part of a system that distributed moral culpability so widely that it seemed to disappear entirely. This diffusion of responsibility allowed ordinary people to participate in extraordinary cruelty while maintaining their self-image as moral beings. The methods used against Anne, torture, public execution, and the deliberate infliction of suffering, were considered legitimate tools of statecraft in the 16th century. Her story reminds us how recently in human history, such practices were not only accepted, but celebrated by those in power. The crowds that gathered to watch executions weren't necessarily bloodthirsty. They were participating in what their society told them was justice. This normalization of cruelty reveals how easily civilized societies can slip into barbarity when fear and ideology override basic human compassion. The religious justifications offered for Anne's treatment highlight the dangerous potential of absolute certainty in matters of faith. Both her persecutors and her supporters claimed divine authority for their actions, creating a situation where compromise became impossible and violence inevitable. The Catholic officials who tortured her genuinely believed they were saving souls and preserving social order. Anne herself was equally certain that her beliefs were divinely inspired and worth any sacrifice. This collision of absolute certainties produced a human catastrophe that benefited no one and left lasting scars on English society. Perhaps most disturbing is how Anne's gender was used against her. The decision to torture a noble woman was unprecedented precisely because it violated social conventions about how women should be treated. Yet those same conventions made her torture more shocking, and in the minds of her persecutors, more likely to break her will. They assumed that a woman's body, considered more fragile than a man's, would yield more quickly to physical agony. They also believed that her maternal instincts would make her more likely to confess to protect other women and children in the Protestant community. Their miscalculation reveals both their underestimation of human endurance and their willingness to exploit what they saw as feminine weakness. The legal innovations created to prosecute an established precedent that would haunt English jurisprudence for generations. The use of torture on a noblewoman, the application of heresy laws to private religious conversations, and the acceptance of evidence obtained through extreme duress, all represented departures from traditional English legal practice. These innovations, justified as emergency measures to protect religious and political stability, became part of the legal toolkit available to future tyrants. Anne's case demonstrated how quickly legal protections could be abandoned when authorities felt sufficiently threatened. Anne's refusal to name names, even under the most extreme duress, challenges us to consider what we would do in similar circumstances. She had every justification to speak. The torture was beyond human endurance. Her cause seemed lost, and silence would only prolong her agony. The people she protected by her silence were not necessarily close friends or family members, but fellow believers she had met in London's Protestant underground. Yet, she chose to protect these relative strangers at the cost of unimaginable suffering. Her decision raises profound questions about loyalty, sacrifice, and the price of conscience. The psychological mechanisms that enabled Anne to endure such suffering remain mysterious even today. Modern understanding of trauma and torture suggests that most people break under far less pressure than she endured. Her ability to maintain silence, despite extreme physical and psychological torture, seems to have depended on a combination of religious faith, personal conviction, and perhaps an unusual capacity for dissociation from physical pain. Her writings suggest that she experienced her suffering as a form of communion with Christ's passion, transforming agony into a spiritual experience that strengthened rather than weakened her resolve. The practical consequences of Anne's silence were enormous, for both her persecutors and the Protestant community. Her refusal to provide names prevented the destruction of the Protestant network around Queen Catherine Parr, allowing the Protestant faction to survive and eventually triumph under Edward V. Her torturers, having invested enormous political capital in her interrogation, were left empty-handed and vulnerable to criticism from their own allies. The failure to break her will became a propaganda victory for Protestants and a lasting embarrassment for the Catholic faction at